Jerry Lewis, the beloved comedian who raised over $2 billion for suffering children, ended his life with an act of stunning cruelty. His will intentionally disinherited all 6 of his sons, leaving them nothing but the cold, hard truth of his rejection. To understand the man behind this final, heartbreaking performance, we must explore the story of a genius who was adored by the world, but haunted by his own private demons. The shadow of vaudeville. Long before the world knew him as a king of comedy, he was Joseph Levitch, a lonely boy born into the traveling chaos of vaudeville. His parents, both driven performers, lived for the footlights and applause, but their son was often left in the wings, learning his first and hardest lesson: the desperate, lifelong need to earn an audience's love. Born on March the 16th, 1926, young Joseph's world was a nomadic existence of second-rate theaters and dusty boarding houses. His father, Danny, was a singer and master of ceremonies from the Russian Empire, and his mother, Rachel, a talented pianist from Warsaw. Together, they chased a fragile dream across the country, their lives packed into trunks. While they were on stage, bathed in the glow of the spotlight, their son was a child raised in the margins, often left in the care of relatives or strangers. This upbringing forged in him a profound instability and a yearning for the one thing that seemed just out of reach: the undivided attention of the people he loved most. This deep-seated loneliness became fertile ground for his comedic persona. To be noticed, he learned to be loud, disruptive, and impossible to ignore. The classroom pranks and impulsive antics of his youth were a desperate campaign for recognition. If he could not get attention for being Joseph, he would command it by being the court jester. Laughter, he quickly discovered, was a powerful tool. It was a way to fill the silence, draw every eye in the room to him, and momentarily soothe the ache of feeling invisible. His humor became his shield and his greatest weapon, a survival mechanism born from the solitude of a childhood spent backstage. The shadow of vaudeville would follow him for the rest of his life, shaping the foundation of his ambition. It instilled in him an insatiable hunger for approval and a fear that if the laughter ever stopped, he too would disappear. This was the unseen burden he carried, the belief that affection was not freely given but had to be earned night after night. And this desperate need for an audience's love would one day become so powerful, it would leave little room for the love of his own family. The record act. Every legend has a beginning. And for the boy who would become Jerry Lewis, it was a simple gimmick. As a teenager of just 15, he stepped onto the stage, armed with a phonograph and a heart full of hope. His performance, which he called the record act, was an act of pure, unbridled yearning to entertain. The premise was straightforward. As the music of a popular singer swelled from a record player off stage, young Jerry would emerge, comically pantomiming the lyrics with exaggerated gestures and expressions. It was less a showcase of tangible talent and more a display of raw charisma. He was not yet a singer or a comedian with his own voice, but he was a born performer who understood instinctively how to command a stage. He poured all of his chaotic energy and need for connection into this silent routine, a performance that was both endearingly amateur and a forecast of the physical comedy that would make him a star. With this modest act, he secured a booking in Buffalo, New York. For a fleeting moment, it must have felt like the start of everything he wanted. But the world of professional entertainment is rarely so forgiving. The act, while full of youthful exuberance, failed to draw a crowd. The engagement ended, and the phone stopped ringing. His desperate plea for applause was met with a deafening silence. It was a harsh and humbling lesson, one that sent him away from the footlights and back into the anonymous world he had tried so hard to escape. Seemingly defeated, Jerry put his dreams aside and took on a series of jobs to make ends meet, working as a soda vendor and later as an usher in New York theaters. Yet, this period was not a retreat, but an unintentional apprenticeship. From the aisles and lobbies, he watched the pictures that enchanted the nation. He studied the audiences, observing what made them gasp, weep, and most importantly, laugh. He was no longer on the stage, but he had never been closer to the heart of entertainment. He was learning the rhythm of comedy, not from a script, but from the people he hoped to one day captivate. This time in the shadows of the theater did not extinguish his ambition, it refined it. The sting of his initial failure was slowly replaced by a deeper understanding of his craft. He now knew charisma was not enough. A true performer needed a magic that could only be forged in the fires of experience. The Catskills Crucible. In the heart of New York's Catskill Mountains, there existed a world of summer resorts and packed theaters known as the Borscht Belt. It was a place where hard-working families came to escape the city heat and where a generation of entertainers found a nurturing stage. It was here, amongst the echoes of his parents' vaudeville dreams, that a hesitant Jerry Lewis was given a second chance to find his own voice. The opportunity arrived through a friend of his father, a man named Max Coleman. He saw past the sting of the young comedian's earlier failure and recognized the raw, untamed talent that lay beneath the surface. With Coleman's encouragement, Jerry agreed to give performing another try, stepping into a world that was both familiar and new. Unlike the indifferent audiences he had faced before, the crowds in the Borscht Belt were warm, receptive, and eager to be entertained. They were a community that understood the value of laughter, and they provided the perfect incubator for his burgeoning style. On these stages, Jerry was finally free to experiment. He shed the silent pantomime of his record act and began to unleash the full force of his chaotic comedic energy. He honed his signature blend of slapstick, manic physicality, and lightning-fast improvisation, learning to control the very wildness that had defined him since childhood. Night after night, he tested jokes, refined his timing, and discovered how to connect with an audience on a deeply personal level. The resorts became his classroom and sanctuary, a place where a stumble was not a failure, but simply part of the performance. It was in this crucible of nightly shows that he transformed himself from a boy who wanted attention into an artist who commanded it. His growing reputation soon caught the eye of a manager named Irving Kay, who saw in Jerry not just a novelty act, but a star in the making. With professional representation, the momentum began to build. The boy who had once been relegated to selling sodas in the back of a theater was now the main attraction, his name lighting up the marquees of the most popular resorts in the Catskills. He had found his footing, his confidence, and his future. The lonely child waiting in the wings of vaudeville was gone, replaced by a polished and relentlessly funny showman. A wartime romance. As the 1940s unfolded, the world dissolved into a great and terrible conflict. A generation of young men answered the call to duty, leaving their homes and dreams behind for the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. For many, life was put on hold, but for Jerry Lewis, destiny had charted a different course. A heart murmur rendered him ineligible for military service, and while the nation was at war, he found himself fighting a very different kind of battle, the one for the heart of a beautiful singer named Patty Palmer. She was a talented vocalist with a poise and elegance that seemed to calm his chaotic energy. They met in the world they both knew best, the vibrant, close-knit community of performers. For Jerry, who had spent his life fighting for attention, Patty's affection was a soothing balm. Theirs was a natural connection, forged over a shared love of music and a mutual understanding of the relentless demands of a life in show business. In the midst of global uncertainty, they found in each other a sense of stability and a shared hope for a brighter future. Their courtship was a whirlwind, and on October 3rd, 1944, they were married. He was still a young man, barely 18, yet with Patty by his side, he possessed a newfound confidence. They were a team, two ambitious performers, united by a singular dream of success. From the outside, their union seemed idyllic, the very picture of a storybook romance. They were young, in love, and poised on the brink of a future that seemed to hold limitless promise. In the years that followed, their family would grow. They would first adopt a son, and then welcome 5 more boys throughout the 1950s. They were building a life together, creating the stable home that Jerry had never known. On the surface, it was the perfect portrait of domestic bliss, a comforting counterpoint to the ever-increasing demands of his career. Yet, the relentless pursuit of stardom casts a long shadow, and the brilliant glow of the spotlight would one day test the foundations of their marriage in ways neither could have imagined. The fateful encounter. It was the year 1945, in a bustling New York City nightclub called the Glass Hat. On the bill were 2 young performers, each with their own ambitions, each trying to carve out a place in the unforgiving world of entertainment. One was a handsome, smooth-voiced crooner of 27, his easy charm and relaxed confidence a magnet for the crowd. The other was a 19-year-old hurricane of manic energy, a comedian whose act was as unpredictable as it was hilarious. They were Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, and though they merely crossed paths that night, the wheels of destiny had quietly been set in motion. They were, in every conceivable way, perfect opposites. Dean was the epitome of classic cool, a man who never seemed to break a sweat, whose voice was like velvet, and whose presence was effortlessly commanding. He represented the kind of suave masculinity that audiences adored. Jerry, on the other hand, was a creature of pure chaos. He was a tightly wound spring of flailing limbs, rubber-faced expressions, and childlike antics. Where Dean was smooth, Jerry was frantic. Where Dean was the melody, Jerry was the delightful noise that interrupted it. On their own, each was a compelling performer, but no one could have predicted the sheer force they would unleash when their 2 worlds collided. 2 years would pass before their paths crossed again in a meaningful way. The setting was the celebrated 500 Club in Atlantic City. Jerry was on the bill, but fate intervened when the other scheduled singer had to cancel. The club's owner, a man named Skinny D'Amato, was in desperate need of a replacement. It was then that Jerry recalled the charming crooner from the Glass Hat. He made a simple suggestion. "I know a singer named Dean Martin." It was a casual remark, born of convenience rather than a grand vision. But it was the suggestion that would alter the course of their lives. Dean got the job, and for the first time, the 2 men officially shared a stage. But the magic that would one day define them was nowhere to be found. Their initial performances were clunky and disjointed. They simply performed their separate solo acts back to back with little interaction. The suave singer and the manic comedian were like 2 different shows on the same stage. The audience was confused, and the club owner was far from impressed. Their partnership was dead on arrival. But in a moment of pure desperation, they were about to stumble upon a formula that would make them the most famous comedy act in the world. The night they found magic. Their act was failing, and the owner of the 500 Club was ready to bring down the curtain on their partnership. With their backs against the wall and their futures hanging by a thread, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis made a decision born of pure desperation. They threw away the script, abandoned their rehearsed jokes, and agreed to walk on stage with nothing but their wits to guide them. What happened next was not just comedy, it was alchemy. Stepping into the spotlight, they let chaos become their guide. Dean, in his smooth and steady way, attempted to sing a classic romantic ballad, but this time, instead of waiting politely for his turn, Jerry unleashed a torrent of inspired pandemonium. He became a one-man wrecking crew, a gleeful agent of anarchy in a tuxedo. He tripped waiters carrying trays of drinks. He heckled Dean from the audience, and he leaped onto the stage to interrupt the song with a series of outlandish gags. It was the kind of disruptive behavior that would normally have gotten him thrown out of any respectable establishment. But then, something extraordinary happened. Dean, the unflappable king of cool, finally broke. Instead of growing irritated with Jerry's interruptions, he began to laugh. It was a genuine, rolling laugh that filled the room, and in that moment, the audience saw beyond the suave crooner to the warm, witty man underneath. He began to play along, trading barbs with Jerry, and the rigid structure of their separate acts melted away into a fluid, freewheeling, and utterly hilarious conversation. The friction between their two opposing styles, which had previously created an awkward tension, was now generating brilliant sparks of comedic genius. The audience was electrified. The polite titters from earlier performances were replaced by waves of roaring, side-splitting laughter that seemed to shake the foundations of the club. They were witnessing something special, something that felt spontaneous, dangerous, and brilliantly alive. They were no longer watching two performers. They were watching two friends, a handsome, straight man and his impossibly silly partner, who were having the time of their lives. It was in that shared, uncontrollable laughter between the stage and the seats that their legendary formula was discovered. When they took their final bow that night, they walked off as a phenomenon. The unstoppable rise. The lightning they had captured in a bottle at the 500 Club was too bright to be contained in a single city. Word of their sensational act spread like wildfire through the entertainment industry, and soon the biggest stages in the country came calling. Martin and Lewis left Atlantic City not just as a successful act, but as a full-blown phenomenon. Their journey took them to the pinnacle of nightclub society, the legendary Copacabana in New York. To succeed at the Copa was to prove you had truly arrived, and they did more than succeed. They owned it, night after night, with their intoxicating blend of sophisticated charm and joyful chaos. From the vibrant stages of Manhattan, their voices soon conquered the airwaves. In 1948, NBC gave them their own radio program, The Martin and Lewis Show, which would beam their unique energy into millions of American homes until 1953. Adapting their highly visual, physical comedy for a medium that relied solely on sound was a tremendous challenge, but their chemistry was so powerful it transcended the limitations of the microphone. They became a weekly ritual for families who would gather around the radio, captivated by the smooth ballads of the crooner and the delightful antics of the clown. Just as they mastered radio, a new and revolutionary medium was dawning: television. Martin and Lewis were perfectly poised to become its first true superstars. In a moment of historic significance, they were the headline guests on the very first broadcast of a new variety series called Toast of the Town, a show that would soon be known to the world by its host's name, Ed Sullivan. Their larger-than-life personas and kinetic energy were made for the small screen, and their appearances on various programs made them pioneers of the television age, defining the nature of comedy for a new generation. During this dizzying ascent, their professional partnership blossomed into what seemed like an unbreakable personal bond. They were two men from vastly different backgrounds, now hurtling through the stratosphere of fame together. In the whirlwind of cross-country tours, radio broadcasts, and television appearances, they relied on each other completely. It was a time of shared hotel rooms and inside jokes, a period of genuine camaraderie where they seemed less like colleagues and more like brothers. Hollywood or bust. With their names celebrated in nightclubs and their voices a fixture on the radio, there was only one frontier left for Martin and Lewis to conquer. Hollywood, the glittering capital of dreams, came calling, eager to capture the duo's magic on the silver screen. Their first role was a modest one, intended as simple comedic relief. But what audiences saw was the undeniable spark of something special, a fire that was about to set the film world ablaze. In 1949, Paramount Pictures signed the duo to a film contract, hoping to translate their immense popularity into box office success. Their debut was in a charming comedy titled My Friend Irma, starring Marie Wilson and Diana Lynn. Martin and Lewis were not the leads. They were cast in supporting roles, brought in to provide a few laughs and capitalize on their nightclub fame. but from the moment they appeared on screen together, their electrifying chemistry and brilliant comedic timing became the heart of the entire picture. Their scenes together were a masterclass in the very magic they had perfected on stage. Dean, with his effortless charm, would try to maintain a sense of order, only to have his world gleefully turned upside down by Jerry's chaotic, childlike antics. The carefully written script seemed to melt away whenever they shared a scene, replaced by the spontaneous energy that had made them famous. Audiences and critics alike were captivated. They had come to see a simple comedy, but they left talking about the incredible new duo who had stolen every scene they were in. The executives at Paramount Pictures immediately recognized they had something far more potent than a mere supporting act. They had found the heirs to Hollywood's comedy throne. The studio quickly retooled their contract, and the era of Martin and Lewis as movie stars began in earnest. Between 1950 and 1956, they would go on to make an astonishing 14 films together, a string of box office triumphs that made them one of the most bankable acts in the world. Their names on a marquee became a guarantee of laughter. They were the kings of Hollywood, but the man Jerry saw as a brother was beginning to see him as a tyrant, and their perfect kingdom was about to crumble. The unwanted reflection. In the world of entertainment, imitation is often considered the sincerest form of flattery. But for a star who had spent his life crafting a one-of-a-kind persona, it could also be perceived as a profound threat. When a young actor named Sammy Petrillo emerged, bearing an uncanny resemblance to Jerry Lewis, the king of comedy saw not a disciple, but a distorted ghost of his own act, and he moved decisively to extinguish the reflection. In the early 1950s, as Martin and Lewis reigned supreme, Petrillo, a performer 8 years Jerry's junior, began making a name for himself. His physical appearance, his vocal inflections, and his comedic style were all a startlingly accurate echo of Jerry's own. Paired with a singer named Duke Mitchell, he created a tribute act that was so close to the original, it was difficult to tell where homage ended and imitation began. For audiences, it was a curiosity, but for Jerry Lewis, this was not about competition. It was a threat to that fragile love from the audience he so desperately needed. His chaotic, childlike persona was not simply a role he played. It was the essence of his identity, forged in the fires of a lonely childhood. The idea that it could be so easily replicated struck at the heart of his deepest insecurities. Rather than ignoring the young performer, Lewis orchestrated a meeting. He invited Petrillo to appear in a sketch for the Colgate Comedy Hour, an offer that on the surface appeared to be an incredible opportunity. The role was minor, but it came with a powerful incentive: a contract with MCA, the same talent agency that represented Lewis himself. To an aspiring actor, it was the chance of a lifetime, an offer of legitimacy from the biggest star in his field. Petrillo, though he later recalled Lewis as being abrasive during their meeting, was persuaded to sign. But the promised work and the bright future never materialized. The contract, it seemed, was not a key to open doors, but a lock to keep them closed. By signing Petrillo to his own agency, Lewis could effectively control his career, keeping his young imitator on the shelf where he could pose no threat. It was a calculated and ruthless move, revealing a side of Lewis the public never saw. Eventually, Petrillo's father managed to get his son released from the contract due to his age. But even after Petrillo was free and resumed performing, Lewis allegedly used his immense influence to ensure that doors remained firmly shut. The unraveling of a brotherhood. For a decade, they were inseparable, a perfect comedic machine that brought joy to millions. But behind the curtain of laughter, a deep and painful fracture was forming, one that would break the heart of Hollywood and set two of its brightest stars on a bitter path. The partnership of Martin and Lewis, once a symbol of brotherly camaraderie, was beginning to unravel. As their fame reached stratospheric heights, the delicate balance of their act began to shift. the nature of their routine, with Dean as the calm center and Jerry as the chaotic force, often led critics and audiences to focus on the more explosive half of the duo. The press began to label Jerry as the genius, the true engine of their success, while Dean was increasingly and unfairly portrayed as little more than a handsome setup man. For a performer of Martin's considerable talent and pride, this narrative was a constant, stinging slight. The man who had been an equal partner now felt like he was being cast as a supporting player in his own show. The easy camaraderie of their early days began to erode under the immense pressure of their empire. Jerry's need for creative control became all-consuming, while Dean, a man who valued a relaxed and effortless approach to his work, grew weary of the constant tension. The friendship that had once been a source of strength was now strained by unspoken resentments and professional jealousies. They were still Martin and Lewis to the world, but behind the scenes, the silence between them was growing louder every day. The breaking point arrived in 1954 in the form of a magazine cover. The duo had posed together for a publicity shoot for Look magazine, but when the issue was published, Dean was met with a devastating visual confirmation of his worst fears. He had been completely cropped out of the photograph, leaving only Jerry's smiling face to grace the cover. It was more than a simple editorial decision. It was a public declaration that, in the eyes of the world, Dean Martin was becoming irrelevant. The private crack in their foundation had just become a deep, public chasm. From that moment on, the joy had vanished, replaced by the cold obligation to finish their contracts. The final, silent bow. Their last film together, ironically titled Hollywood or Bust, was a painful affair. The effortless joy that had once defined their on-screen chemistry had been replaced by a visible strain, the jokes landing with a hollow echo. Behind the scenes, the two men who had been like brothers were reportedly so estranged they could barely speak to one another. The laughter felt forced, the smiles a performance, and the film itself became a melancholy monument to a partnership that was over in all but name. What followed was one last contractual obligation, a final series of engagements at the place where their New York triumphs had begun, the Copacabana. On the night of July 25, 1956, exactly 10 years to the day after their legendary partnership was formed, Martin and Lewis took the stage together for the last time. The audience, largely unaware of the deep rift between them, roared with applause. But the performance was shadowed by a profound sadness. During Dean's final song, a quiet and poignant ballad, Jerry walked out from the wings. There were no gags, no interruptions. He simply stood beside his partner, and as the song concluded, the two men shared a final, heartfelt embrace. With tears welling in their eyes, they took their final bow, and the curtain fell. They walked off the stage in opposite directions, not with anger, but with the deafening silence of a friendship that had been lost. The greatest comedy act of a generation was over. For Jerry Lewis, it was something far more terrifying. For a decade, his professional identity had been inextricably linked to Dean Martin. Now, for the first time in his adult life, he was on his own. The partner who had been his anchor was gone, and Jerry Lewis was adrift. He questioned everything: his talent, his future, his very ability to stand in the spotlight alone. A voice in the desert. In the glittering, neon-drenched landscape of Las Vegas, a crisis of confidence was about to meet a twist of fate. Adrift after the split with Dean Martin, a hesitant Jerry Lewis was trying to find his footing when a desperate phone call presented him with an impossible choice. Judy Garland, the beloved songstress, had fallen ill and could not perform. In that moment of crisis, an opportunity arose, and the voice that answered the call that night would signal the stunning rebirth of a star. Following the painful end of his partnership, Jerry was lost. He and his wife, Patty, had retreated to Las Vegas, not for the glamour, but for a quiet escape from the uncertainty that now clouded his future. The man who had been a whirlwind of motion was now standing still, terrified of the silence that had replaced the roar of applause. It was then that Sid Luft, Judy Garland's husband and manager, reached out with an urgent plea. Garland had been stricken with strep throat, and he needed someone to fill her prestigious spot on the stage. He asked Jerry to do it. The request must have felt like a monumental challenge. To step onto any stage alone was daunting enough, but to do so as a replacement for the legendary Judy Garland was a trial by fire. Every insecurity that had plagued him since the split came rushing to the surface, and yet some instinct, some flicker of the old showman's spirit compelled him to accept. With his heart pounding, Jerry Lewis agreed to face his greatest fear and walk into the spotlight alone. That night, he did not rely on the familiar slapstick and chaotic antics that had made him famous. Instead, he walked to the center of the stage, took a deep breath, and began to sing. He poured a decade of heartache, friendship, triumph, and loss into his performance. It was a raw and vulnerable display, the heartfelt confession of a man fighting not just for his career, but for his very identity. The audience, which had come expecting one kind of legend, was instead mesmerized by the birth of another. The response was a tidal wave of warmth and affection, a rapturous ovation that seemed to shake the desert sky. It was the validation he so desperately needed, the proof that he could stand on his own. The auteur of comedy. He was no longer content to simply be the star in front of the camera. He wanted to be the storyteller behind it. Armed with the confidence from his solo rebirth and an unprecedented new contract from Paramount Pictures, Jerry Lewis seized complete control of his cinematic destiny. He was about to transform himself from Hollywood's highest-paid performer into one of its most innovative and demanding filmmakers. In 1959, he signed a deal that was the envy of the industry. A contract that granted him a level of creative freedom few artists had ever known. But it was a scheduling crisis in 1960 that would truly allow him to flex his newfound power. Paramount had decided to delay the release of his film Cinderfella until Christmas, leaving a gaping hole in their summer movie lineup. The studio turned to its biggest star with an almost impossible request: create a new feature film from scratch in a matter of weeks. For Jerry, this was not a burden. It was a golden opportunity to prove he was more than just a clown. The result was his directorial debut, The Bellboy. With a punishing schedule that required him to film in the daytime at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami and perform on stage at night, Lewis knew the traditional methods of filmmaking were too slow. He could not afford to wait a full day to review the film rushes. And so, out of sheer necessity, he invented a technique that would revolutionize the industry. He attached a video camera to his film camera, allowing him to play back a scene the instant it was shot. This system, now known as Video Assist, gave him the immediate control he craved and has since become a standard practice for directors all over the world. His approach to the story was just as unconventional. The Bellboy was less a plot-driven narrative and more a series of brilliantly executed visual gags, a nearly silent movie that was a showcase for his physical comedy. This inventive style made the executives at Paramount deeply nervous. Fearing they had a commercial failure on their hands, they pulled their financial backing from the project. In a moment of supreme confidence, Jerry Lewis did not back down. He put up his own money to complete the film, betting his personal fortune on his singular vision. It was a gamble that paid off magnificently. He was now a true auteur, a master of his own cinematic universe. The 20-year silence, solo success, for all its rewards, could not mend a broken heart. For 2 decades, Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin shared the same city, moved in the same circles, and breathed the same Hollywood air, but they lived in completely different worlds. Theirs was a silence that became legendary, a testament to a wound so deep that all the fame and fortune in the world could never truly heal it. Following their split in 1956, both men forged remarkable new careers. Dean became an icon of effortless cool, a beloved singer and actor who charmed the world. Jerry, in turn, became a pioneering filmmaker, an auteur celebrated for his comedic genius. They built separate empires, surrounded themselves with new friends and colleagues, and yet the ghost of their partnership lingered. They would attend the same industry events, sometimes finding themselves in the same room. But an invisible wall always stood between them. They would exchange polite, distant nods, but the easy warmth and brotherly affection were gone, replaced by the heavy weight of unspoken history. As the years stretched on, the initial anger of their separation began to fade, leaving behind a profound sense of regret, especially for Jerry. In quieter moments, he would often confess to interviewers the deep sorrow he felt over their prolonged estrangement. He spoke of Dean not as a former colleague, but as the great love of his professional life, admitting that not a day went by that he did not miss his partner. For all his triumphs as a solo artist, there remained an undeniable void, a part of his story that felt painfully incomplete. Then, in 1976, a mutual friend decided that 20 years of silence had been long enough. During Jerry's annual Labor Day telethon, Frank Sinatra, a man who loved them both, orchestrated a moment of television history. As Sinatra stood on stage with a visibly surprised Jerry, he announced he had brought a friend with him. From the wings, looking elegant and relaxed, Dean Martin emerged. The studio audience erupted. Jerry's face was a portrait of shock, disbelief, and then a wave of overwhelming emotion. The two men shared an awkward but deeply touching embrace. It was a beautiful, heartfelt moment of public reconciliation, but some fractures run too deep for a single gesture to truly repair. The other woman. While he remained married to the woman who had known him long before the world did, Jerry Lewis lived a life of profound contradictions. His dalliances were an open secret in Hollywood, a seemingly reckless part of the chaotic life he led, till one day, the woman who had stood quietly by his side for nearly 4 decades decided that she had finally had enough. To the public, Jerry was the consummate family man, a devoted father to his 6 sons, living a life of domestic stability with his wife, Patty Palmer. But behind this carefully curated image was a much more complicated reality. His restless energy and the constant temptations of superstardom led him down a path of repeated infidelity. It was a part of his life he never tried particularly hard to conceal. Another facet of the larger-than-life persona he had built, a man who seemed to operate by his own set of rules. Patty Palmer had been his anchor through it all. She was the young singer who had fallen in love with a struggling comedian and had watched him become one of the most famous men in the world. She had raised their children, often single-handedly, while he toured the globe, or poured his obsessive energy into his films. For 36 years, she weathered the storms of his turbulent career and endured the private heartache of his indiscretions with a quiet grace and remarkable fortitude. She was the steady, unwavering presence in his perpetually spinning world. But in 1980, that steady presence chose to walk away. Patty filed for divorce, a decision that signaled the end of one of Hollywood's longest-running, if most complex, marriages. Her action was not one of sudden anger, but of quiet resignation, the culmination of decades of pain. It was an act of profound strength, a declaration that she was ready to reclaim her own life. As this monumental chapter of his life was closing, a new one was already beginning. During the filming of his movie Hardly Working, he met a talented ballerina named Sandra Pitnick. A new romance blossomed, and in 1983, they were married. This new beginning would ultimately cast a permanent shadow over the family he left behind. A new beginning, an old pattern. With a new wife by his side, and soon a new daughter, it seemed Jerry Lewis had been given a rare chance to rewrite his family story. This second act of his personal life offered the promise of a quieter, more focused domesticity. But as he began to build this new world for himself, the doors to his past and to the family that had been with him from the very beginning were quietly and permanently closed. His life with his second wife, Sandra Pitnick, was a world away from the constant whirlwind he had shared with his first. This was a more private, more insular existence, seemingly designed to protect him from the chaos that had once defined his life. In the early 1990s, their family was completed with the arrival of their adopted daughter, Danielle. After raising 6 sons amidst the relentless pressures of his rise to superstardom, Jerry was now a father again, in a much different stage of his life. It was, for all intents and purposes, an opportunity to experience fatherhood with a presence and dedication that had perhaps been impossible in his younger, more tumultuous years. But as he poured his affection and attention into his new family, the emotional distance from his first grew into a vast and uncrossable gulf. The separation was not just from his former wife, Patty, but from the sons they had raised together. The threads of connection, already strained by years of his demanding career and complex personality, were now decisively severed. It was a pattern that had emerged before in his professional life, an inability or an unwillingness to repair broken relationships, choosing instead to discard the past and start completely anew. This profound emotional cutoff was a tragic prelude to the final, shocking statement he would one day make. By removing his sons from his present life, he was methodically setting the stage to remove them from his legacy. The unpredictable father. To the world, he was a lovable clown, a tireless humanitarian who championed the cause of children. But to the 6 sons who grew up in his home, the man who came home at night was often a stranger. They lived in the shadow of his immense talent and his equally immense and unpredictable heart, never knowing which version of their father they were going to get. For decades, the public image of Jerry Lewis the father was inextricably linked with his compassionate work on the annual telethons. He was seen as a paternal figure to the nation, a man who could cry on camera for the plight of a suffering child. But after his time on Earth concluded, his own children began to speak out, sharing stories that revealed a stark and painful contrast between the public philanthropist and the private parent. Their testimonies paint a portrait of a childhood spent navigating the emotional minefield of a mercurial genius. His youngest son, Anthony, described a father who was profoundly unpredictable. He recalled that the children would brace themselves each evening, uncertain if the man who walked through the door would be the brilliant, funny artist or a cold, critical figure. To live in such an environment was to exist in a constant state of emotional uncertainty, a childhood where affection was often conditional and approval was fleeting. Anthony's account was tinged with a deep sadness, acknowledging the pain of what he called an emotionally abusive atmosphere. His older brother, Gary Lewis, who had achieved his own measure of fame as a musician, offered a much harsher verdict. His words were stark and unflinching. He called his father a mean and evil person, insisting that the legendary comedian had been incapable of showing his children genuine love or kindness. His testimony was a devastating portrait of a father whose own deep-seated insecurities seemed to prevent him from nurturing the very sons who bore his name. The contrast between the beloved global icon and the cold patriarch described by his son was as profound as it was heartbreaking. A will of stone. A last will and testament is a person's final message to the world, a definitive statement of what truly mattered in the end. For Jerry Lewis, that message was a cold, deliberate, and stunning act of exclusion, delivered in the precise language of the law. It would become his final and arguably most controversial performance. Jerry Lewis had battled health problems for much of his adult life, surviving heart attacks in 1982 and again in 2006. When his time on this earth concluded in 2017, at the age of 91, the world mourned the loss of a comedic titan. Tributes poured in from generations of performers he had inspired. But as the details of his final wishes emerged, a darker and more painful aspect of his story came into sharp focus, confirming the heartbreaking testimony his sons had already shared. His will was a simple document in its structure, leaving his considerable estate to his second wife, Sandy, and their adopted daughter, Danielle. But it contained one clause that sent shockwaves through Hollywood and beyond. In stark and unforgiving terms, the document stated that he had intentionally excluded his 6 sons from his first marriage: Gary, Ronald, Scott, Christopher, Anthony, and Joseph, from any inheritance whatsoever. The document went even further, making it clear that their descendants were also to receive nothing. There was no ambiguity. It was a final, formal, and brutal rejection. For those who had followed his life closely, this shocking act was also tragically the logical conclusion to a long-established pattern. The man who had severed ties with his brilliant partner, Dean Martin, and the father who had emotionally walled himself off from his first family, was now making that separation permanent. It was the ultimate expression of his need for absolute control, an attempt to meticulously curate his own legacy and erase the parts of his life he had chosen to leave behind. The whispers of co-stars. Long after the cameras stopped rolling and the laughter of the audience had faded, other stories began to surface. Decades after the height of his fame, whispers from some of the women who had worked alongside him in the 1960s painted a dark and troubling portrait of the man who held absolute power on his film sets. These accounts added another complex and painful layer to the legacy of Jerry Lewis. In 2022, 5 years after his passing, an article in Vanity Fair magazine brought together several of his former female co-stars. For the first time, they shared their collective experiences, telling stories of a work environment that was often far from the joyful, comedic world presented on screen. Their allegations were not of a single incident, but of a pattern of deeply troubling behavior that cast a long shadow over their time working with the celebrated auteur. The women spoke of a man whose conduct could be deeply inappropriate. Their accounts described a director who created a culture of intimidation, engaging in verbal abuse and professional mistreatment. They detailed instances of harassment and unwanted advances, describing a powerful figure who blurred the lines between the professional and the personal. In the Hollywood of that era, the director was king, and Jerry Lewis was the undisputed monarch of his productions. The young actresses in his films were often in a precarious position, their burgeoning careers almost entirely dependent on his approval. The portrait that emerged from these testimonies was one of a profoundly complicated and often cruel man. It echoed the stories told by his sons of a father who was dangerously unpredictable. The same genius who could meticulously craft a brilliant sight gag could, according to these women, also be a source of fear and discomfort for those who worked with him. The anarchist of comedy. How, in the end, do we remember a man of such profound and painful contradictions? How do we reconcile the brilliant artist with the broken man? Perhaps the answer is not to be found in a simple verdict, but in honoring the undeniable legacy of the artist, the comedic pioneer who, as the actor Jim Carrey once so perfectly stated, stretched the boundaries of reality in an act of pure anarchy. Before Jerry Lewis, American comedy was a far more polite and predictable affair. He shattered that mold completely. With a fearless commitment to silliness and a body that seemed to defy the laws of physics, he elevated slapstick to a high art. He was a brilliant innovator, not just in the technology he invented for filmmaking, but in the very language of comedy itself. He was unafraid to be loud, to be grotesque, to be childlike, and in his willingness to be the ultimate fool, he gave generations of audiences the pure, uncomplicated gift of laughter. His work was a joyful rebellion against the ordinary, a celebration of the chaos that lies just beneath the surface of our well-mannered world. His influence is immeasurable, a foundational pillar upon which much of modern comedy was built. One can see his spirit in the inspired absurdity of Steve Martin, in the raw, confessional energy of Richard Pryor, and in the incredible physical elasticity of Jim Carrey. He was a trailblazer who proved that comedy could be both deeply intelligent and wonderfully ridiculous, a lesson passed down to countless performers who followed in his giant, floppy footsteps. And yet, this brilliant legacy is forever intertwined with the difficult and often heartbreaking truths of his personal life. He was the lonely child of vaudeville who grew into the difficult father. He was the loyal partner who became the embittered rival. He was the celebrated humanitarian who, in his final act, turned his back on his own sons. To remember Jerry Lewis is to hold all of these conflicting truths at once: the genius and the tormentor, the innovator and the insecure soul. Ultimately, his is not a story with an easy morale. It is the epic, challenging, and often uncomfortable saga of a deeply flawed and profoundly gifted human being. If you found this deep dive into the life of a Hollywood legend compelling, please let us know by liking this video. For more untold stories from the golden age of cinema, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Until next time.